This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
These guys are going to be a two-headed team. In fact, they remind me of ant and deck. Do you know you can't hire ants without deck? And every program they do together. So, yeah, Robin and Adbullah. So if you've got a total of 20 minutes, then you're not going to get 20 minutes each. Just be mindful of that.
I thought you were a friend, Kwaku. Ant and deck, please.
Okay, thank you everyone for coming out and supporting events like these. Obviously it's really important to recognise what work is being done in Black History. It's not just in Black History Month, but across the year, and the work that we've just been listening to hopefully reflects that, and what we are going to be talking about will do the same, we hope.
Thank you. And as good historians, we were given an inquiry to pursue in this session, and we're going to try to answer Miranda and Michael's inquiry question. As well as the big question, what is happening in Black British history, which is always the question, they posed this question: to what extent does Black British history need to take into account the conscious or unconscious exclusion of people of African origin or descent from the historical record? Wow, big question. And the simple answer, yes, it certainly does. And we want to emphasise that it is in fact most important that our young people wrestle not just with the content of history, but also the process, also understanding how history is produced, and that they do encounter questions about how the history of people of direct African descent has actually been treated across the centuries. And so that's a part of history education that we call historical interpretations. And actually it's been a part of the work of history education for a number of years now. It's part of the national curriculum, it's part of GCSE, it's part of A-level. So it is most certainly very important that our young people not only look at the content of Black British history, but also look at the processes behind Black history and how these exclusions have happened. Last year, we were reminded by David Olusoga in his talk that Miranda gave for us, that in the media, you always have to make choices. And people always, he said, people complain, oh, you didn't put that in the programme. But you have to make choices. And that's also true of history teachers. You have to make choices. And so there are going to be some things that are absent and some things that are present. But some absences are toxic. And we would say that the absence of Black history, of history of people of African descent across the centuries, and in our schools still, is a toxic absence. But it's not just the content of history that could have toxic absences.
It's overall the way that it's taught. So it's the interpretations that are offered. If you're offering a mass narrative, if you're mentioning Black figures in history as though it were just a list, that in itself is not adequate. It's not giving the full story, because it's obscuring the interpretation which has moved certain historians or teachers towards selecting a particular figure. What students need to understand when it comes to Black history, and to overcome this toxicity, is what lies behind the selection of these figures that we have now moved towards choosing.
And And so we actually have an organisation. Abdullah and I are a team in what we call Justice to History. And so what we would say is that today, in our short talk, we hope to do justice to history by exploring controversial historical interpretations through classroom inquiries. So we actually want to present you a historical inquiry this afternoon that looks at the historical interpretations of black people and people of African descent through the centuries. But it is Thursday afternoon and people have been sitting for a long time. So let's have a quiz. This is actually very often how we start our work in the classroom, because everybody likes a quiz. And so this is an odd one out quiz. We have 4 different images, just like on Have I Got News For You. And you have to select which you think is the odd one out. Sir Thomas Browne, the United Nations General Assembly, Hegel, and Martin Spafford. So which of the 4 is the odd one out?
I know the others one.
Yeah. So if you want to think, well, maybe one of these people is a good guy, then it has to be Martin. So let's see if Martin is the odd one out. Well, what characterises Martin, if I can get this to work. There we go. What characterises Martin's place in this inquiry is that Martin was part of the group in 2007 who crafted the then History National Curriculum. And the importance of that curriculum was that when it made the teaching of the slave trade and the abolition of slavery compulsory, that's what the government did through the agency of David Lammy in particular. When they did that, Martin's group pointed to the history of Africa before slavery. Whoops. Does this work? Yeah. If you see there, West African kingdoms. Martin and the group said it's most important, if you're teaching about the experience of black people, you don't just teach slavery, you teach the history of West African kingdoms. So Martin is unquestionably a good guy. And so what about the others? Well, maybe if there's one other good group, maybe it's the UN, maybe the United Nations. Sometimes they get things right. Well, the United Nations, from this year forward for 10 years, has declared an international decade for people of African descent. And so the world at the moment should be, according to the United Nations, should be promoting greater knowledge and recognition of and respect for the culture, history and heritage of people of African descent. So the whole world should be on the case. So the UN must be good guys as well. So if Martin and the UN are good guys, does that mean...
Well, it leaves us with 2 choices.
Because one person's going to be a bad guy. Who looks worse?
Well, I know who looks more fierce. I don't know if that's his sort of just general appearance. But I mean, the more recent one is obviously Hegel.
So he'll be a good guy.
Well, the assumption would be history is about progress.
This is a bad guy.
So maybe
He comes earlier, a European gentleman from, perhaps 2 centuries earlier. The assumption is that he's the bad guy. But in fact, he was a historian. He wrote a popular encyclopedia in 1646 called On Vulgar Errors. And in it, he describes some of the fallacies regarding racist beliefs held by clearly held by people in England, because it was written for an English audience. And he describes things like the Hamitic myth, the so-called curse that God put on all Africans due to their connection to Noah and his son. And in it he says, well, that can't actually be a curse, because when people come back from Africa, they seem to be quite happy with the colour of their skin, so their blackness cannot be a curse. And in it, he catalogues quite a number of things which show that people in England had an understanding of some equality of race, and that people of different colours were, by no means inherently inferior. So it really starts to give us an idea of, where have these ideas developed from. I mean, they've obviously started to seep into, sort of thinking in the 19th century. So it's quite obvious who the bad guy is, the one who looks like, the Bond villain, Hegel.
And Hegel's the odd one out, because Sir Thomas Browne and Martin Spafford and the United Nations General Assembly all say Africa has a positive history. Africa has so much to offer. But what did Hegel say? Africa is no historical part of the world.
A land enveloped in the black colour of night. I love the dramatism in there. So what we did was, one of the principles that we employ when we teach in schools is we try to use, should we say, the sort of some of the more controversial statements of characters like characters like Hegel, and we try to use them as an antagonist, almost like an Aunt Sally, to set them up as somebody that the students can challenge and rail against throughout the lessons. Of course, it has the benefit of maintaining the interest of the students, but what it does is it allows students to start to question how history is formed. It gives them an insight into the construction of historical interpretation without you presenting it in an overly intellectual way. You give them a simple statement, and then you use that as your inquiry question. And the inquiry question that we use, and we are using in school right now in London, is how dark was the story of Africa before 1900? And that's obviously in reference to Hegel's statement.
And so the first few lessons of the inquiry set up the 19th century European view, and we look at Hegel, and we look at some of the colonial enterprises like Leopold of Belgium in the Congo and Cecil Rhodes in South Africa. But then we introduce a piece of evidence that we're pretty sure Hegel would not be happy with. The golden rhino, found.
It was found, it would be modern-day South Africa. I think it was found in 1933, as it says there. And it was, it's a lot smaller than it looks, but the intricacy, the detail, and the fact that it obviously, is a symbol of a developed, society and civilization, clearly demonstrates to students that archaeology, historical evidence can be used to challenge some of the racist sort of views held by Europeans in the 19th century. So we ask students, you've just found this golden rhino, you can see how intricate it is. What do you think Hegel would have done with the golden rhino? And their response was?
And mostly they would say he'd have hidden it. Well, that actually bears very close relation to what actually happened to the golden rhino, because the South African government at the time did hide it, because it didn't fit their political world, and so the golden rhino and lots of other treasures of Mapungubwe were locked away for decades until the regime changed in the late 90s. And we now have access, and I think the golden rhino is coming to London at some stage. It's supposed to be coming to the British Museum. But it's not only the golden rhino of Mapungubwe that gives lie to the interpretation of Hegel and others, but also the site of Great Zimbabwe. And Britain was heavily involved with this when the country was known as Rhodesia. And we introduced the students to these ruins and to two different interpretations. So again, they're looking at how these sites have been interpreted. And we look at 1938 and 1998 and the way that interpretations have changed. So the young people are learning how interpretations change over time.
One thing they know, obviously from the aerial shot there, is that you can't hide, the site of Great Zimbabwe in the same way that you can hide the treasures that were unearthed in Mapungubwe. So what is it that the Rhodesian authorities, the white supremacist government in Rhodesia, tried to do with this? And we found this poster, and we just asked the students, just to think about that along the same lines as what Hegel do with it. What would the British authorities do, who have this vested interest in maintaining white minority rule? And then what are the ideas about the British in this poster? And secondly, what the Africans, the ideas of Africans are represented in this interpretation? And we employed a device whereby students are encouraged to think about what lies behind an interpretation. What is the historical context that gives meaning to an interpretation?
And you can see in the picture the fascinating aspect of it being the figure in the middle, that the British have actually positioned a woman, looks like some kind of goddess or queen, who clearly isn't black African. She probably represents the Queen of Sheba, which is that was the myth that the British were putting out, that actually this site of Great Zimbabwe owed nothing to the black Africans, who in the poster, of course, are bowing down to the splendid sight of this queen, who is Indo-European of some kind.
I mean, there is a mystery in there, as in who built it, but the one thing which isn't a mystery is the person in the photo who's being subservient and who's naked and who's almost uncivilized in that sense. So there is a riddle, but there is a fact also, and the fact is in the foreground.
3 minutes.
And behind this poster lay the British Empire, and behind the poster lay the idea of the Dark Continent. And so what we encourage the students to understand is that behind interpretations there are forces, there are ideas that are happening. And what we do is we then move to 1998. We have a clip from Henry Louis Gates's programme about the history of Africa, which is proudly black African. There's a black African conservator who takes him round the site, explains how the civilization was organised. And behind this, of course, is the end of the British Empire in Africa. And things like the Civil Rights Movement, the movement for racial equality, that has allowed interpretations to change. And so this inquiry has now been taught in several schools. And we'd just like to close by giving you the result of one of the inquiries when it was taught in a girls' school in South London. The teacher there gave the students, who were absolutely incensed by Hegel, they gave them the opportunity of replying to Hegel. Hegel, what do you need to know? And this is one of the girls' pieces of work. Why was Hegel wrong to call Africa the Dark Continent? And you can see, do you want to read?
Right on the
right-hand side,
the Benny bronzes. But then you see Great Zimbabwe, the manuscripts of Timbuktu, obviously roads describing the continent at the top. But what we found most powerful was that the comment that she gave to her teacher at the end, which was in the text box. I feel like I have learned more about myself. It's the fact that she's been learning about Africa through in this particular way, through this inquiry, made her feel that she had a much greater understanding of her background and her family's background. It gave her a much fuller appreciation of Africa's history. Okay. I found out that Nigeria was colonized, and some of my ancestors was from there. It made me ask my dad more about my history, and I found out that I'm part Portuguese. I also learned that my mum's great-grandfather had Portuguese friends.
So this is a wonderful testament to the opportunities that young people can have when they actually start to look at interpretations and question the exclusion of Africa, and when they can be shown that this man was most undoubtedly the odd one out.
Thank you.